Hello, everybody, and welcome to our second installment of Shakespeare 400, Death, Remembrance, and Resurrection, 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's passing. It's a big year for those of us in the Shakespeare community, and what a wonderful time to reflect on Shakespeare's many plays, poems, sonnets, reflections on mortality. No poet, as we know, wrote better about love and romance than Shakespeare, but fewer people recognize just how contemplative he was on issues of death and suffering and grief, and what was on the other side as a good Christian, a man we have his Bible, a well-underlined Bible, a man who used his Bible in his plays, and what comes after death, how to get beyond death. So as we move forward here, we ended off segment one talking about epidemiology and the various diseases and plagues and poxes that was so hard on English life as the capital grew exponentially from 1500 to 1600 when Shakespeare was working. Tiny lanes, tiny streets, no sanitary plumbing, lots of rats under the straw on the floor, rounding up dogs and cats and killing them because you thought they spread the plague, leaving the rats to run free. And step back for a moment as we ease into the second segment. Let's just focus on the Black Plague. We talked about smallpox, influenza, by the way. Influenza, which may have been ague, which may have been as big a killer as anything else in the 16th century, but we don't have accurate records because of the symptoms being so masked. But smallpox, malaria, typhus, unsanitary living conditions, sepsis. Let's talk about plague, which may have been the single biggest issue that they dealt with. And a little history, a little epidemiology lesson. The Black Plague, the bubonic plague otherwise known, it really swept Europe about the year 1346. And what had happened is that ships and caravans on the Silk Road from Central Asia, the particular rats we're dealing with, the Indian black rat in the Central Asian plains there, those rats, as we mentioned before, had the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which is the cause of bubonic plague, is something part in their stomach linings. And so when blood-sucking fleas hopped on the rats, they imbibed that bacteria, and then when those fleas hopped onto human hosts and bit them, they transmitted the disease. They were transmitted by rodent fleas who feeding on bacteria-carrying rats. The disease moved from East Asia along the spice roads, and then by the time you got to the Renaissance, the actual Black Death, the famous Black Death, was a 14th century, about 150 years before Shakespeare's birth, was a 14th century problem, but the plague wouldn't go away. At the end of our last segment, we pointed out that in 1665, a good 50 years after Shakespeare's death, the city of London continued to grow exponentially, hundreds of thousands of people every 40, 50 years, and the city didn't get much bigger. In 1665, you had the Great Fire of London, which burned out much of the city, much of the old city, and forced London to rebuild and expand. And one of the benefits of the Great Fire of 1665, a good generation or two after Shakespeare's death, was that all those closed living spaces, all the rat-infested, old, cramped wooden dwellings burnt. And they burnt down and they burnt out the rats. And so really after 1665, the plague was much more moderate and intermittent. The other side of the coin of the Great Fire of London of 1665 was that it put an end, more or less, to the hyper-virulent strains of the flu, the epidemics that broke out so often in Shakespeare's day. So once it came to Europe, though, once it got to Europe, and as Europeans started using ships to investigate all ports east, ports west, to discover the New World in the 1490s, rats, those same rats that came from India in cargo vessels, came from India over the Spice Road and had made a home in England and all the European countries, those same rats now boarded ships. And as European ships, English ships, sailed to foreign ports, while the ships were sailing in ports, those rats would often, as they were wont to do, get off the ships and scuttle down the ropes, and then the plague was nobody knew this, of course, it was purely accidental, but the plague was spread to far-flung corners of the globe beyond Asia, where its origins came from Asia and Africa. To this day, as we, in 21st century world that we live in, Africa is the continent that still sees the most plague, and India will often have some flare-ups of it as well. You'll see that anywhere you have people living in rural areas with unregulated rats. And so there are three kinds of plagues, continuing our mini epidemiology. What a shame they didn't know this 500 years ago, things they could have done to fight this. But there's the bubonic plague, the pneumonic plague, and the septicemic plague. And the lucky ones, the lucky Europeans who developed the bubonic plague, they had a 40% chance of surviving it. The bubonic plague is named for those buboes, those pus-filled pockets that appear on an infected body. And they attack the lymph nodes, and they attack the immune system. So not only did the bubonic plague attack the lymphatic system, it weakened the immune system in the sense that fighting off the infection that came with it was exceedingly difficult. But still, you had a fighting chance with bubonic plague, and by far the vast majority of cases of plague were bubonic. These were the plagues. This was the plague that was spread primarily by the fleas off the rats. And once in the body, the bubonic plague could mutate. It could become septicemic plague. The infection could spread from the lymphatic system into the blood system, or it could become pneumonic, and that's when it spread to the lungs. The latter two, unfortunately, individuals who came down with either septicemic or pneumonic plague had really no chance of survival, particularly given the sanitary and medical conditions of the 16th century. The pneumonic plague was particularly vicious symptomatically, attacking the lungs. It was the most deadly. It was clearly the most deadly form, and interestingly, it was the pneumonic plague. The only strain of the Black Death, the Black Plague, that could be translated from person to person really was the pneumonic plague. When people coughed or sneezed, or you came in contact with those droplets from sneezing, coughing, which was a major symptom of the lung plague, pneumonic plague, breathing those in, getting those on your skin, almost guaranteed infection. The blood plague, of course, technically you could get it, but you'd have to come into some serious contact with the blood of the victim, with the dead, the corpse, the cadaver. The bubonic plague itself, you had the least chance to spread it. And so the fleas were major carriers, and the problem was once you were bitten, once you had been infected, it could bypass or move through the lymphatic system much more gravely into the lungs of the blood. To give you a sense of this, Shakespeare's world was profoundly touched by this, as had every world been since the 14th century. 1593, as early as 1593, at the very outset of Shakespeare's career, there was a huge plague, 30% mortality in the city of London. I mean, that's a huge number in a relatively confined place. Another plague 10 years later, the very year Queen Elizabeth died, another plague that closed the theaters, 30% mortality, and an important plague in 1608 that really ran intermittently from 1608 to 1610 that took just tens of thousands of lives as well. And so it makes common sense that when you have these kind of plague outbreaks, you had to close the theaters down. The theaters were the NFL coliseums of their day. They were places that everybody congregated at. And many of the plays took place on Sundays, church day. And so there was a constant war between the city fathers and the preachers and the players. Because same thing happens to us today, right? Where people are skipping church on Sunday, skipping Sunday service to go to the game or to watch the game, or they're rushing out of church early to get home and get a good seat for the game. So too the plays threatened the pulpit, and there were many invectives, many pamphlets, many sermons preached against these godless plays. And it must be said in all reality, too, that the playhouses, the first bunch of playhouses, Shakespeare's Globe among them, 1599, the Globe Theatre was built. The plays were held down by the river on the southern part of London, in what was considered a seedy part of town, Southwark, right? And so they were docks, and there were lots of prostitutes, lots of pickpockets and criminals. And so at any given Shakespearean theater, any play of the Globe or of the Swan Theater, which we looked at briefly last week, you would have these kinds of petty crime, anywhere you got that many people together, particularly on a Sunday when they weren't at church listening to sometimes 2 and 3 hour long sermons, you would have the Puritans who would eventually close the theater during the interregnum in 1642, good 25 years after Shakespeare died. They were constantly lampooning and lambasting the idea that you could mark it down in the city books that 9 months after almost any play production, a whole number of bastard children were born. Children were born out of wedlock. And so it was a very racy scene. And playgoing in Shakespeare's day was a very different affair than it is for us. Obviously, they didn't have electric lights. The Globe Theater itself had an open interior. It was a circle, really an octagon, with the front open, the top opened. So the people in the stands, particularly the groundlings, the people who paid the penny the penny price to get in. The poorer people who had to stand on the ground, they were rained on. You had to do it in daytime, and you did it on Sunday. You closed them down during the worst part of the winter. And so it really was a problem for the players in terms of lifestyle, in terms of survival when the plague hit. And they had a more or less rule that whenever the city of London could document 30 or more plague deaths a week, that was a automatic call to shut the theaters down. So 30 or more plague deaths a week in a city the size of London, that was when what passed for the National Health Institute back then, the people in control of this, they would shut the theaters down. And it made sense. That many people jammed together in a playhouse. And they also believed, too, we must remember that in Shakespeare's day, certainly true in Catholic Europe in the 14th century when the Black Death first hit, and it was certainly true in Protestant England, Anglican England in the late 16th century, that they believed, too, that plagues were whatever else they were, whatever medical or biological function plague served, they were also visitations from God. That all great plagues certainly had a corporeal component, a bodily component, but they were also visitations for sin. And when you yoke the fact that the theaters were great places of pickpocketing and illicit sexual rendezvous, prostitution, lots of high-spiritedness and hijinks, and the pregnancy rate that came from them, you really did have a situation where the pulpit saw the playhouses not just as rivals for church attendance, but as the cause of sin and degradation and the visitation from the divine, the almighty punishment for the great sins of the theater going. So 1593, 1603, 1608, number of periods during Shakespeare's career where the theaters were completely shut down. I had mentioned in our last segment that during these infectious times, they would often take the plays on the road, go to smaller cities with smaller groups, and perform truncated versions. And Shakespeare's immediate family was deeply touched by plague, as were pretty much anybody living in London or the greater environs of London. It would have been impossible not to have friends, relatives, family members, neighbors who died with great frequency. You were lucky to survive it yourself. Shakespeare was the third child born to his parents, and he was the first to survive. His sisters, Joan and Margaret, two girls, both died in infancy of the plague. As far as we can tell, the death records weren't as complete, but that would have aligned quite exactly with certain plague times. So Joan and Margaret died before Shakespeare was born. Shakespeare was the first boy and the first child to survive infancy. Anywhere between 1 and 3 out of every 10 children didn't make it out if they were born. The mortality rates for birth were very, very high. Sometimes as high as 1 out of 3 babies born would be dead upon childbirth or in the process of childbirth. If they managed to be born, they had a better chance to make it to 10 years old. But still, between 1 and 3, depending upon what numbers you look at, between 1 and 3 children only, 1 in 3 children died out of 10 by the time they got to 10 years old. So we also know that Shakespeare's own sister died, Anne died at age 7 when Shakespeare was a young man. Shakespeare's brother Edmund was dead at 27 from the plague. His own son Hamnet, we're pretty sure, most tragically for Shakespeare, died 11 years old from the plague. And Shakespeare's 3 grandsons, after he himself had died, his 3 grandsons probably died of plague. So what a remarkable toll this took in London. Shakespeare was at the heart of London, Southwark, and what was going on in his playhouses were very central to the economy and the vibrancy of the city. And that gave rise to the topic of our talk today, the Memento Mori. Memento Mori is a Latin phrase that means remember to die. In a culture like this, where death was everywhere, in a culture like this, where we talked about the plague, we talked about a number of diseases, we also talked about the idea that things that you and I could survive quite easily, cut from a rusty saw, for instance, or a nick, some kind of traumatic bump on the head, a concussion, things that we can deal with readily and handily in terms of staving off infection, of dealing with pressure on the brain, blood on the brain, they couldn't do that. So routine things that you and I see as more or less, even a concussion, more or less par for the course today. It's monitor it, take care of it. Simple cuts, nicks, various pustules, pimples, these kind of things, boils, could radically become septic. You could very easily have them become infected to the point of things like tetanus setting in. So lifespans were short. Sexuality among the poorest classes in London, which is to say most of the poorer classes, the sexual mores were really quite loose in terms of prostitution, other aspects, the things that we've talked about already. So hygiene and human contact and grubby living conditions and no running water, or no hot water in many instances, and highly, highly unsanitary bathroom requirements led to just a powder keg, rats everywhere. And we mentioned before that London, the tight-packed city of London in the 16th century, was as dangerous a place to live as probably any place in human history. And so how did the Elizabethans, the Jacobeans, how did they handle all this death prevalent everywhere? They came up with this idea of the Memento Mori. And literally it means remember to die. In other words, remember you're going to die. And as Christians, this should not only not bother us if we are true Christians, we should reflectfully realize that whether we have 20 years, 10 years, or 100 years on this earth, that's going to come and go in a quick age. And that whether we die now or die tomorrow, we all owe, as St. Paul said, we all owe God a death. It's the consequence of sin. And so here you see how they did it. It's the equivalent of whistling in a graveyard. In a world that couldn't avoid death, I mean, every day during plague time, can you imagine every day hearing that bell toll? They rung those great big cathedral bells, right? Those great big church bells in all the parishes when a parishioner died of the plague. And during these horrible times of plague and epidemic, I mean, those bells would be going 24 hours a day. That mournful dirge-like ringing of the bells. People would be constantly dragging stretchers and litters across and carts across the streets to take the dead, to book them, and to bury them. Mass graves in cemeteries. Very, very, very dangerous on the psyche. Hard emotionally and intellectually to deal with. And so what the Europeans did, the Elizabethans did, was something really kind of brave. They decided rather than to pretend it wasn't happening, rather than to dismiss it, they looked it in the eye and they began to create art and culture that completely immersed themselves in the idea. This is a medieval, a 14th century, right when the Black Death was raging, image of the picture on the left is the dance macabre, the dance of death. And the image here, the theme is that death plays the tune, that sooner or later we will all dance to death's tune. And you can see the skeleton. These are all creatures that have gotten out of their graves. And what's particularly grisly about this is that they're not just skeletons. We come to associate death with the Grim Reaper, right? The skeleton with his scythe mowing people down. But what's remarkable about this particular image is notice that the skulls all still have hair on them. And the creature on the right, the skeleton on the right, actually its entrails, you can still see it's got its withered and split skin in the process of decomposition, and its entrails have begun to fall out. And if you look at the skeleton that's in the process of getting up from the grave, his grave shroud, his winding sheet, is being pulled off, and up he steps. And you can see a little worm there around his arm at the very top by the neck. With worms, right? Remember, man, that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Worm food. And all of these creatures, these living dead now, are getting up and they're dancing to the piper. This is a way of reminding people, you're going to die, so whether you survive the plague or not, we really should turn our attention beyond these horrible spectacles of death. Reminder, right? Memento, remember to die. And if you look at the picture to the right here, we have what's called an emblem from the 16th century. Emblem books were books of little pictures like this, oftentimes for people who couldn't read. The vast majority of English people, Europeans in the 16th century, could not read, had no formal training in reading, and they certainly couldn't read Latin. And what they did as a way to try to educate, these are also educational images for those who do not have basic literacy. They put together these books of emblems like the one you see on the right here. And those emblems were basically talking pictures. So that if you knew what the characters represented, if you knew what the images represented, you could most certainly read the message without book learning. And so in the picture, we have some very, very familiar figures, even now 400 years later. We know that that's death on the left. We know it because death, it was portrayed as the skeleton, carries his dart, right? The 16th century equivalent of the scythe. He carries his dart. That's the dart. It's the opposite of Cupid. Cupid, love, Eros, carried bow and arrow and would strike you with that to make you fall in love, a holdover from Greek mythology. Here, death has the consummate image. He's got the dart, the spear. And interestingly, death walks arm in arm with a very familiar figure. Wings, an old man with wings and an hourglass. an hourglass that has expired. Of course, this is Father Time. And so death and time, so you see right away now, without the book learning, without the ability to read words, we see that you have speaking pictures. Death and time walk hand in hand. The consummation of time is death. When we go on to the next world to be with God, there is no time. There are no clocks in heaven. There is no yesterday, today, or tomorrow. Time, the sense of time is really an earthbound thing. God exists outside of time. God is not bound by time in any meaningful way. And so we see the arm in arm, death and time. The hourglass has extended. Right? The hourglass is over. So that would suggest something. There's death. There's time. Time is up. So we have, in lieu of a human being who's being taken by death, you have a candle. And there's that overlarge human-sized candle, and death is about to snuff its flame out. You may recall from contemporary culture the Elton John song, Candle in the Wind, right? Ironically, Elton wrote it both for the death of Marilyn Monroe and for the death of Princess Diana. But this idea of human life like a candle, right, that can be snuffed out. So the human in the image is represented by this candle, this light. And you think about what a wonderful thing a light is, a candle, but how easy is it to extinguish that? A sudden gust of wind, a little bit of damp, a cold maybe, a little bit of this, and how easy, how fragile a thing is that spark of human life. Of course, the blaze, the flame itself, represents the soul. And in snuffing out the candle, the soul passes on to someplace else. This is a scene of death, time and death teaming up to take a human life. But having said that, all is not lost. Up in the upper left-hand corner, you see the sun. And that's S-U-N is a metaphor for the S-O-N. That sun is a reminder. That light, the light of the Son of God, it cannot be extinguished by time and death. It's beyond their reach. This eternal light, remember what the Gospel of John tells us. In the beginning there was, or the book of Genesis says, in the beginning there was light, and we learn in the Gospel of John that the light came into the world. That's the light that's unextinguishable. So above the human light, the frail human light, is the eternal light of God. And then you have, for the more erudite readers, those who could read both Latin actually, you have the Latin tag, tempus erit. Time will be. Time will be. It's coming. If we move to the next images now, you had plague images like this in emblem books. And emblem books didn't just contain images of death. They were about hope, about faith, about joy, but death played a major role in a culture like this. Here you have a group of wealthy Londoners who are fleeing the city. You can see on the right side the city gate, the little arch. And these are the well-to-do. The poor didn't have the means or the wherewithal, and they had no place to go. The poor couldn't flee the city. They were doomed. They were left to their own misery. But the wealthy, as so often, have this advantage. They're leaving. The wealthy Londoners are leaving town. But as you can see, there's a moral to the story. Even as they're leaving, you see the elegant ladies in their expensive carriage. You see all the men finely dressed. And yet you see the skeletons that dot the scene, right? One in the very middle, one to the right above, and one to the extreme left. And the moral of the story is you can run, but you can't hide. Running to the suburbs, running to the countryside, that's not going to save you. And so these were the kind of messages that were moral messages. They were monetary messages. They were messages designed to combat vanity, to get people to consider their end, because there was nothing you could do about it. And so to prepare yourself for death was the best way to overcome it, because only by preparing your soul to meet God, to be in a state of grace, could you get beyond the terrors that death held for everybody else. Among these emblem books, the most famous is the great artist Hans Holbein, who did an entire series called The Danse Macabre, The Dance of Death. Dozens and dozens and dozens of images of death in various guises. This, of course, the first one on our left, is Adam and Eve. You see the angel Michael in the cloud with his great sword, chasing Adam and Eve from the garden because of their original sin. And they're in their nakedness there, and they know shame, right? You can see Eve embarrassedly covering up her breast. Shame is an idea that was born with sin. And who's waiting for them on the other side of the garden? There's death. And death carries a viol, right? A little stringed instrument, much like a violin. The music's about to start, the music of death that will go on until death is done at the end of time. And in the next picture, we have vanity, right? There's a beautiful woman, and she's in a beautiful gown. Her serving girl is helping her array herself in beautiful clothes. Her hair is braided beautifully. She's so engrossed by the vanity of prettiness, the vanity of youth, the vanity of costly garments, that she doesn't seem to notice that the person helping her on the left is Death. She's so engrossed in the vein that she doesn't realize that Death is actually putting around her neck not a fancy necklace of gold, but a necklace of bones, little bones. And notice there on the chest right in front of her, time's up, another hourglass. Moving a little further, we've got the image of the judge. Here's a judge whose job it is to be impartial before the law. You can see the person on the left, the poor soul on the left, awkward. He's a poor man. He's dressed as in poverty. He has no ability to speak for himself. He's at the mercy of the court. He seeks justice. And what you see on the other side is the rich dandy, the rich fop with his elaborate clothes, is reaching into his bag to pay a bribe to the judge who has his outstretched hand. Justice is being perverted. And what you see here is, unbeknownst to all of them, Death has climbed up on the back of the judge's chair and is removing his staff of office, right? Death will come for the just and the unjust, right? And the consequences of justice and lack of justice will be much more concrete in the next life beyond death. One of my favorite images is the next one. You have a nun, a pretty young nun, who has turned her head. She's on her knees saying her prayers before an altar. And she's turned her head away, pretty little thing, to be captivated by that handsome young courtier. In the Elizabethan day, that's how men showed off, showing a little leg. Notice how the stockings come up to the knee, and from the knee forward, it's all garments. But being able to put a little knee, to have a nice calf, right, was a way to attract the lady's eye. And this nun, who should be focused on her Christian devotion and her vow of chastity, she's been beguiled. He plays a lute. He's got a little guitar. He's serenading her. And her attention at the least opportune time, her attention has been turned away from the altar and to vanity, in this case, sexual vanity. And her waiting woman, the other nun in the image, unbeknownst to the two of them, is Death. And there she is snuffing out just like that picture we saw first. Death is now snuffing out the flame, and Death comes to the nun. And that brings us to our first real foray into the words of Shakespeare. We're going to do a lot more of this today in the remaining two segments. I want to start with Hamlet, perhaps the one play more than any other whose whole focus is death. It's the one play everybody's heard of. It's probably the most famous Shakespearean play. It's in the running for the greatest play ever written. It's a fantastic play. It deals with issues of ambition, incest, ideals of vanity, but the major theme of that, not in revenge, of course. You may recall the plot of Hamlet. Hamlet's father's murdered by his uncle. His father's brother murders the king and takes the throne. His mother, terrified of being alone and not queen anymore, she's not terribly interested in the murder. In order to preserve her position, she immediately marries her brother-in-law. Right? So you've got a kind of incest here. And poor Hamlet has got to figure all this out. This is the play where the ghost, back from the grave, right? Beyond the grave. One night, the ghost of Hamlet's father visits him in Denmark on top of Castle Elsinore and warns him what happened, and tells Hamlet, you must get revenge. But even more than revenge, this is a play about death. Hamlet is the play that contains the very, very famous gravedigger scene. It's a scene where towards the end of the play, when Hamlet is despairing to the point of suicide. Hamlet is a play, of course, among other things about suicide. Hamlet, who has seen his mother, in his words, become a whore, whose father, his beloved father, has been murdered, right? His uncle, traitorous villain. At one point, Hamlet can't get over it. He says that one should smile and be a villain. How can my brother-in-law, how can my uncle, right, smile? How can he be so wicked inside and yet have that insidious smile on his face all the time? And so Hamlet is the legendarily torn man. He's alternating between the desire to get revenge and the fear of what murder means. It's a really gripping play. And at the very end of the play, he comes to a graveyard. The woman he loves, Ophelia, unbeknownst to him, his girlfriend has died, and they're bringing her body for burial. Hamlet has been away for a while. They sent him to England to get rid of him, and he came back. He didn't realize that the love of his life, was dead. And so he's kind of hiding in the graveyard because he's a wanted man. And as he's hiding there in the graveyard with his best friend Horatio, they're kind of outlaws, they're on the run. Ghost still has put the burden of revenge upon him. As they're hiding there in the graveyard, all of a sudden, they see these two gravediggers. In Shakespeare's day, they called them clowns. A clown in Shakespeare's theater was simply a low-born mechanical person, what we would call a unskilled blue-collar worker. The word didn't have the kind of creepy, funny connotation of clowns today. It was a unique way of saying somebody low-born doing mechanical work. We call them gravediggers. And so as Hamlet and Horatio are watching, they're watching this gravedigger, and he's singing in his work. And he gives a great song, right? A song about vanity. It's a Memento Mori song. But age with his stealing steps hath clawed me in his clutch, and hath shipped me into the land as if I had never been such, right? It's a pretty jaunty tune, but it's all about death. Age sneaks up on a man, right? Age with his stealing steps. And this is where, trust me, I'm there. You get to the point where, one day you wake up and suddenly you're older. You don't feel older, you're getting older, but all of a sudden one day you realize, son of a gun, it's there. And that's what death does. Age with his age and death, age with his slow creeping steps, hath clawed me in his clutch. And once he gets you, once age and death get their hands on you, they dump you into a grave. And he hath shipped me into the land as if I had never been such. And as he's digging in the grave and singing, boom, at the end of his shovel, up comes a skull, right? Up comes a skull. And this sort of stuns Hamlet, I should say, stuns Horatio. The old metaphysical promise that when you're buried, you're buried. That when they put a body in the grave in a consecrated Christian cemetery, you should be able to sleep until Judgment Day. That you were put there. Remember we talked a little bit in the last segment about the metaphysical concerns of the Elizabethans. I mean, what happens if your body's separated? What happens if your bones are pulled apart? What happens if part of you gets blown off in the war in France and you got to go get your leg? How does the body get, as Christians believe, how does the body get physically put back together on the last day if it's scattered all over the universe? And so this was a serious, serious metaphysical problem for them. As the gravedigger digs, he's actually, we find out, digging up an old body to make room for the new body. In Shakespeare's day, they didn't have modern farming implementations. They weren't agriculturally savvy the way they were. They didn't have acres and acres and acres of land to waste on cemeteries. They needed every inch of arable land to be able to grow enough food. And that often meant that they had to recycle graves. Most churches in Shakespeare's day, including his own church in Stratford-upon-Avon, had attached to the church what was known as a charnel house. A big room which kept bones. When you dug up the old bones in the churchyard to make room for the new, they had to do something with them. So they brought them into the church and they set them in these bone rooms. Shakespeare's own church. Can you imagine being a little boy? Can you imagine being little William Shakespeare in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon? And there you are listening to the sermon from the priest, the minister, and right next to you is a room full of bones, skulls, thigh bones. Right? And so these Memento Mori images, I mean, they were just storing the bones there, but it cannot help but breed a contemplative nature about these things. And so the skull is dug up, and Hamlet says, that skull, he makes this Memento Mori observation, that skull, Hamlet says, had a tongue in it and could sing once. How this knave jowls it to the ground as if it were Cain's jawbone that did the first murder. That's a line, isn't it? He's asking that reflective Memento Mori. In other words, the whole play Hamlet is one living, breathing, acted Memento Mori. He reflects upon death in this graveyard. That skull, it had a tongue in it once. It too could sing once. And you see the pun? How this knave jowls it to the ground. We know jowls, of course, are cheeks. It's also a euphemism in the Elizabethan age for curls, right? So he's punning. Hamlet's punning in the graveyard. This is what we call gallows humor, right? There's a lot of gallows humor in Shakespeare's plays. Looking death in the eye and laughing at it or trying to make light of it. That, my friends, by the way, is another great definition of Memento Mori. The remember to die tradition is a way of looking death in the eye and being brave about it. And sometimes that involved humor. That skull had a tongue in it. It could sing once. How this knave jowls it to the ground as if it were Cain's jawbone that did the first murder, right? And you got that link back to the very first murder in human history. Remember, the very first biblical murder in human history was brother murdering brother. And so you can see how even in this graveyard, Hamlet's obsessed about death, but obsessed about the death of his father and how he was murdered by his brother. As if it were Cain's jawbone that did the first murder. Why, even so. And now, my lady worms. To whom does the skull belong now? It's nothing but the property of the worms, chapless, and knocked about the measured with a sexton spade, right? This skull, his only love is the worms. He's chopless, right? The bottom part of the skull, right? The only thing that keeps the lower jaw attached to the upper jaw is muscle. And when that rots away, the bottom jaw falls out. And so there's a pun there, right? Chopless, the skull is. And knocked about the mazzard by a sexton's shovel. This could have been some courtier. This could have been some rich nobleman. And now what happens to him? Here's fine revolution. Can you imagine Hamlet says, here's fine revolution, and we had the trick to see it. Did these bones cost no more the breeding, but to play at loggets with them? Is that the purpose? What is the meaning of life existentially here? Did these bones cost no more to bring them into the world than to play at loggets at them? And loggets was an Elizabethan game where you put a post in the ground, a wooden stake in the ground, and you took turns throwing little slabs of wood at the stick to try to hit, kind of like horseshoes with sticks. And these bones now for Hamlet, getting knocked around like this, juggled around, bones that should have existentially been able to rest in peace until Christ came again, are now suddenly do you see the existential danger of this? That dead things don't stay dead in Hamlet. We've already got the image of the father of Hamlet, right? Who's supposed to be dead and buried, the ghost of whom, in a bit of a purgatorial state, comes back to Hamlet and says, at one point he says to him, if I could tell you about my prison house, if I were allowed to tell you about my prison house, the ghost says, it would make the hair on your head stand up. I'm not allowed spiritually to tell you what I suffer. But he's not dead. And neither ultimately is Yorick's skull as it comes up again. That which we buried comes up again. That's a theme in this play. Did these bones cost no more the breeding, but to play at loggets at them? My bones ache to see them knocked around so. And at that point, Hamlet turns to the gravedigger and he asks him a very, very memento mori question in a world of death. Excuse me, sir, but how long will a man lie in the earth ere he rot? How long? I mean, it's a wonderful metaphysical question, philosophical question, but it's also terribly practical, right? I mean, it's the gravedigger's job to deal. He should know his trade. He should know what he's putting into the ground and when he can move it, right? And so the gravedigger says, in faith, if he be not rotten before he dies, as we have many pocky corpses now, that will not scarce lay the laying in, he will last you some 8 year, 9 year. Tanner, he will last you 9 year. In truth, if the body be not rotten before it's dead, 'cause don't you know, we have many pox-ridden corpses nowadays that have been rotted from the inside out before they're dead. Syphilis, remember? All right? We have many pocky corpses nowadays that won't even last until the wake. They're so destroyed by disease from the inside out. They're already half rotten. Faith, if he be not rotten before he die, as we have many pocky corpses nowadays, that will scarce hold the laying in, he may last you some 8 year, 9 year. A tanner, he'll last you 9. So you bury the body of a man whose job was tanning leather, he'll last a little bit longer. To which Hamlet says, why he more than another? Why, sir, his hide is so tanned with his trade that it will keep out water a great while, and your water is a sore decayer of your horse and dead body. Right? And you see that rustic talk. Shakespeare was brilliant at this. So one of the things so remarkable about Shakespeare is that his kings sound like kings, his lovers sound like people in love, and his low-born fools sound like low-born fools. All right? That speech there. Well, think about what a tanner does, right? He spends his life tanning the hide of leather, working with chemicals and processes in the sun. His own skin becomes leathery and tan, too. Why, sir, his hide is so tanned with his trade that it will keep out water a great while. And don't you know, water is a sore decayer of your horse and dead body. Whoreson, you know what that means, right? Son of a whore, right? One of those epithets. A tanned body, a leathery body, keeps out water from seeping into the grave. It keeps water from invading the skin. Water, moisture will decay a body quickly. And so you see this really odd union in Hamlet's graveyard scene of metaphysical, spiritual, religious, theological, philosophical concerns, and really, really, really visceral body concerns. I mean, again, this is, in some ways, this language is infinitely more moving, poetic, humane, thought-provoking than even those graphic images. Because what you're getting here is this sense of, right? It's that ultimate human conundrum. How can we be human beings in a Christian sense, that great Christian paradox? How can we be made in the image of God but doomed to die? How can our bodies be models of what the divine is and yet suffer such corruption? It's a wonderful, wonderful philosophical existential problem. And then the gravedigger says, Here now's a skull. This skull has lain in the earth 23 years. A wholesome mad fellow's it was. A pestilence on him for a mad rogue. You know, he poured a flagon of Rhenish on me head once. This same skull, sir, was Sir Yorick's skull, a king's jester. What, Hamlet says? Here's a skull now. Do you know, this skull's lain in the earth exactly 23 years. Hamlet, we know, is exactly 30 years old. Hamlet was 7 when this man died. And can you imagine being the Prince of Denmark? Can you imagine being the only son of the king in a great big castle surrounded by all these adult, you're going to be the next king, surrounded by all these adult courtiers, certainly no little kids. Who do you think a young boy's best friend would be in a castle like that? Well, why not the king's jester, right? The king's fool, with his motley and his little bells on, always telling off-colored jokes, right? This was a man Hamlet loved. This may have been Hamlet's only companion. 23 years ago, this man died. Hamlet was a 7-year-old boy. Here's a skull now. Hath lain ye in the earth 23 years. What a son of a whore he was, a mad fellow it was. What a funny man. And there's that word, a plague. A plague upon him for being such an outrageous rogue. You know, he poured a flagon of wine on me head once. This same skull, sir, was Yorick's skull, the king's jester. And of course, Hamlet takes the skull in his hands, this. And you get this just moving, haunting, famous scene. Alas, poor Yorick. I knew him, Horatio. A fellow of infinite jest, most excellent fancy. He hath borne me on his back 1,000 times, and now how bored in my imagination it is, my gorge rises at it. Here hung those lips I have kissed I know not how oft. Where be your jibes now? Your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table on a roar? Not one now to mock your own grinning, and quite chopfallen? Now, get you to my lady's chamber, and tell her let her paint an inch thick. To this favor she must come. Make her laugh at that. And you see it, right? Hamlet doesn't know that his love, his lady, his Ophelia, is in the process of becoming this very thing as he speaks. She's dead. The process has already begun, but he doesn't know it. Alas, poor Yorick. I knew him, Horatio. Do you know, he was always kidding around, infinite jest. He had the most excellent imagination. How many times as a little boy did he bear me on his shoulders up to bed? How many piggyback rides? And now, to see him this way, it troubles me. It makes me want to puke. My gorge, I could barely keep it down. Right here hung those lips that I kissed every night before bed. Where are your jokes now? Your little dances? Your songs? What happened to your little flashes of wit that were wont to set the whole table laughing? Come on. If you saw somebody living with a big, stupid grin on his face like this, you'd mock him. What? Cat got your tongue? Well, something's got your tongue. Tell you what. Send this to my girlfriend's chamber. Send this to Ophelia. And you tell her, let her paint the makeup on an inch thick. Let her hide what she is. To this favor she's going to come. You make her laugh at that. It's a horrible scene. And you know something Hamlet doesn't know. that her body is in procession. It's on its way to this very grave, the very grave that holds his first love, so to speak, that funny, silly jester, bound to make any little boy laugh. That grave's being evacuated now, so the woman he loves can fill it. It's a really haunting image. To what base uses we may return, Horatio? To what base things we descend into? Why may not imagination trace the noble dust of Alexander the Great, till he find what's left of Alexander stopping a bunghole, a cork in a beer barrel? And Horatio says, oh, you shouldn't think about it that way. No, Horatio. Hamlet says, look, Alexander died. Alexander was buried, the greatest man ever. He died, he was buried. Alexander returneth to dust. Dust is but earth. Of earth we make loam. Of loam we make cork, beer barrel corks. And why of that loam whereto he was converted? Might they not now stop a beer barrel? Do you not know, Hamlet said? Imperious Caesar, dead and turned to clay, might stop a hole to keep the wind away. Is that it? What happened to Julius Caesar? Maybe his ashes are used as mud to go ahead and spackle up a hole in the wall. How do you know it's not so? And then you get this great situation a little bit later in the play, after the revelations in the graveyard. And really, if you read Hamlet carefully, it's the graveyard where Hamlet has his awakening. When he sees, it's one of the most moving scenes in all of literature. After all of this philosophical memento mori speculation about death in the abstract, death in philosophy, the theological implications of death and decay, all of a sudden, they wheel the corpse of his love in. And standing as he is behind a tombstone and watching, remember, he's still a wanted man, he sees who it's for, and his heart is broken. So beautiful. She still hasn't yet decayed. So beautiful and pallid in death. And they lay her in the tomb. And her brother leaps into the tomb, and picks up the corpse of Ophelia. And he says, lay her in the earth, and from her fair and unpolluted flesh may violets spring. What a beautiful image. But you see what he does, the brother, Laertes. He skips over the decay. One last time he cradles his sister in his arms and he says, lay her in the earth, and from her fair and unpolluted flesh may violets spring. But he left out the hard part. How do you get from pretty body to pretty violets? A lot of decay, right? All that rot, all that corruption, which ironically becomes fertilizer to be able to grow these beautiful violets. But in Laertes' brotherly imagination, not being fixated on death the way Hamlet is, Laertes conveniently skips over the rotten part. That's the part that Hamlet can't get beyond, up until this moment. Hamlet jumps into the grave with him, and they wrestle over her body. I loved her, Hamlet said. 40,000 brothers with all their love could not make up my sum. And something changes him in there. It's as if finally in the graveyard, coming literally face to face with death, you could smell it. At one point, he has to put the skull of Yorick down because the decay smells so bad. But there's something about that face-to-face encounter. It's no longer paintings on walls, murals. It's no longer poems. It's face-to-face with what death is. And seeing his love dead that way, it changes him. Go to the last one for the day. He meets his adversary, Claudius, the king. Hamlet, in a fit of anger, accidentally killed Ophelia's father, Polonius, counselor to the king. And what Hamlet, he's an accident, he didn't mean to do it, but he's dead. He thought he was killing the king. So he drags Polonius by his ankles up the stairway and leaves him in the hallway. And everybody in the castle is running around wanting to know where the corpse of Polonius is. Claudius finally confronts Hamlet and he says, now, Hamlet, where's Polonius? Tell us, Hamlet, where is the body? At supper. Not where he eats, but where he is eaten. Don't you know he's dead? A certain convocation of politic worms are even at him. What a thing to say, right? He's at supper. When you're dead, you're at supper, but you're the menu. Where is Polonius? He's at supper, not where he eats, but where he is eaten. A certain collection of politic worms are even at him. Did you know Claudius, that your worm is your only emperor for diet. Nothing in the world eats better than a worm. I mean, think about it. We fat all other creatures on the planet to make ourselves fat. And we fatten ourselves for maggots. Who eats us? Did you know that your fat king and your skinny beggar are but variable service? 2 dishes to exactly the same table. The fat king and the lean beggar, the worms aren't going to get much. But a big fat king like you, Claudius, Hamlet says, that's the end. Did you know that a man may fish with a worm that hath eateth a king, and eat of the fish that hath fed it? What an imagination, right? A man may pull a worm out of the ground. That worm may have in its guts the flesh of a king. The king may be inside the worm. A man may fish with a worm that hath eateth a king, and then eat the fish that ate the worm. And Claudius says, what do you mean by this? Nothing, but to show you how a king like you may go to progress through the guts of a beggar. The worm ate the king, the fish ate the worm, the beggar ate the fish, so the beggar now has fish, worm, and king in his guts. And the next time the beggar, goes number 2, guess what gets crapped out? You, kings like you. That's the Memento Mori tradition. We'll be back at this again in section 3. It's going to get more intense. We'll see you then.